Hello, everyone. I'm happy to welcome you on this second day of the 4th Carceral Geography Conference held in Brussels under the rain. Not under the rain because we are in a proper building, but we will today hear people from around the world, beginning with Australians. This is a nice moment for them. It's the evening. For us, it's early in the morning, but it's a good way to cope with different clocks. Today we'll have 3 sessions, not 4, because the 4th slot will be a closing discussion. So in the program that you find on carceralgeography.com, you will find all the links to the different sessions, and the registered attendees will get by mail an invitation to the closing discussion, because the closing discussion won't be a live event. It will be a Teams meeting so that we can interact. We can open our microphones and our cameras, and it will be easier to have a chat around the future of our field and the thoughts we'd like to share about these 2 days and about the days to come, and maybe the next Carceral Geography Conference, because I'm sure there will be a 5th one. Today we will begin with Emma Russell, who will be presenting conceptualizing carceral mobilities through bail court ethnography, churn, stretch, and webs of exclusions. You have the floor.
Oh, apologies. Is that my slideshow up? Yep, great. Thank you. Apologies. So I'm speaking today from the stolen and unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, a place that you might otherwise know as Melbourne in Australia. It is 7 p.m. at night here, and we also had 30+ degrees Celsius weather today, so I feel very, very far from Brussels right now. But I'm very grateful for the organisers for bringing us all together and persisting through these challenging digital worlds. So my paper today presents some of the findings from a collaborative research project that I've undertaken with Bree Carlton and Danielle Tyson from Deakin University and a local not-for-profit community legal centre called Fitzroy Legal Service. And this service has done extensive work on prisoner justice issues and decarceration projects. So the main focus of the broader research project has been to investigate the significant growth in the women's prison system, especially remand growth. So the methodological approach of bail court ethnography, as the title of my paper signifies, grew out of an early conversation with Fitzroy Legal Service, where someone literally said, "We just need someone to sit in the bail court and tell us why women aren't getting bail." So that's what we set out to do. And the short answer is that the system is really stacked against them. So we've presented the findings, or some of the initial findings from this research, in a co-published report with the legal service there on the slide on the left. But then the paper I'm presenting today really draws from and builds upon a co-authored article that's just been published in Punishment and Society titled Carceral Churn. So this notion of churn emerged as a kind of unexpected finding during our fieldwork. So over the last decade, the unsentenced prison population in Australia has increased by 86% and now makes up 1/3 of those imprisoned nationally. So rates of increase have been highest for First Nations people and women, and those otherwise experiencing social and economic deprivation. So for instance, roughly half of the adult prisoner population report that they expect to be homeless upon release from prison. In Australia, police and prison systems are governed at the state level, and the state of Victoria, where our fieldwork was conducted, has recently implemented a series of changes to its bail laws in a bid to make them the most onerous in the country. Legislative changes have been backed up by significant state investment in carceral infrastructure. So the 2019 to 2020 Victorian state budget, for example, included 1.8 billion Australian dollars for new prison construction. So on the back of this sustained escalation of pre-sentence lockdown, our research was driven to investigate the microdynamics and the politics of bail decision-making in the courtroom, where we could effectively study the bail laws in action. Our fieldwork site was the busiest and most central bail court in the city of Melbourne. We conducted 100 hours of non-continuous observations of the bail and remand court and 13 semi-structured interviews with criminal defence and duty lawyers working within the court. We did this fieldwork in the middle of 2019 and early this year in 2020, immediately prior to the closure of open courts, which have been replaced by online hearings during the COVID-19 pandemic. So our approach to court observation was informed by literatures emphasising the importance of studying carceral spaces and sites up close, and particularly when we got to the analysis stage, also by the emerging subfield of sensory criminology. Upon commencing observations of the bail court, it quickly became apparent that although we were keen to investigate lockdown and carceral capture in the bail and remand system, movement and mobilities were everywhere. While the idea that movement can be used for punitive ends in carceral environments is well established by now, there are productive power effects that arise from these mobilities that deserve further interrogation. Beyond the coercive movement of bodies, the bail court was evidently productive of new subjectivities and new spaces, and experiences in this system were profoundly sensorial. So the premise upon which I begin this paper is that at its most basic, the bail and remand court is a space of carceral judicial power that authorises the transfer of people from homes, streets and communities to the prison. In so doing, it transforms criminalised subjects into prisoners. But it also transfers criminalised people back to their homes, streets and communities, transforming these into transcarceral spaces through the imposition of temporal and spatial controls, such as curfews, mandatory reporting, supervision and surveillance, summons and geographic exclusions, as well as interventions that target the body and the mind, such as mandated DNA swabs and psychiatric assessments, for example. So in the remainder of this paper, I aim to contribute to existing understandings of the importance of mobilities to carceral systems and power by exploring the transformative, expansionary and transcarceral functions and effects of mobilities in the specific context of the bail and remand system. I do this by briefly considering three key concepts that emerged from our fieldwork, which are churn, stretch and webs of exclusion, and provide examples of each. So conventionally, to churn is to move or cause to move about vigorously, such as waves in a wild sea, while to churn out is to produce mechanically, as in writing or art when large volumes of work are produced. Churn thereby implicates both movement and productivity. For the purpose of this research, carceral churn refers to the production of carceral subjects via the disciplined movement of people through the circuits involved in the bail and remand system. Police stations, court cells, enclosed transport vehicles, prisons and so on. The bail court's churn reproduces social and economic marginality and constructions of criminality, and the stretchy qualities of the bail and remand system both reflect and service a project of carceral build-up. So in our recent article, I argue along with my colleagues that the bail court's churn reproduces criminalisation in large part through sensory cues and effects. The churn funnels people through the delineated, segregated and hierarchical spatial architecture of the court and court transfer systems, which variously dull, distort, deprive and assault the senses. So the slide here provides two examples of the carceral spaces through which people are churned, both of which could be described as kind of liminal sites in the sense of being temporary points of transfer and holding within a larger carceral system. So one here is the truck that transports people between the prison and the court and vice versa, that we came to refer to as the sardine tin for obvious reasons. The other example here is the bail court's holding cells, which are in the basement of the court building. These were often referenced in our fieldwork and invariably described as an abject space, cold, overcrowded, always lacking natural light and basic amenities. So the truck and the cells here make clear the sensory violence that's intrinsic to carceral mobilities. They also affirm the volumetric nature of penal power, as described by Peters and Turner, since the mobilities involved in the bail and remand system are here revealed as both horizontal to and from the prison and court, and also vertical up and down within the levels of the court building. In interviews, lawyers described how the deprivations of the court's basement cells frequently alienate and instill fear amongst those held in them. We further observed how moving through these cells before one's bail hearing also begins a process of normalising an accused person's seemingly inevitable pre-sentence incarceration. Each bail hearing would begin with reciting the length of time the accused had already been in the cells on remand. And relatively often, people's hearings would be delayed due to being designated too unwell to ascend from the basement to the bail court, and thereby extending their time in custody. So much like the productive mobilities involved in the churn, the stretchiness of carceral systems is not a contemporary innovation, but our research found that recent punitive changes to bail laws have both relied upon and capitalised upon this quality of carceral systems. So an example of this is that in 2013, weekend hearings were introduced at Melbourne's Bail Court. These hearings initially occurred during the hours of 10 AM to 4 PM, but they were extended along with weekday hearings following a review of the bail system in 2017 to 10 AM to 9 PM because of a steady increase in the number of matters heard and finalised per year. In their submission to this review, Victoria Police urged the Magistrates Court to consider extending court sitting times to 24 hours per day, revealing a police vision of non-stop and circuitous carceral churn. Fortunately, the review did not consider this feasible or required, but the more pressing systemic questions of mass criminalisation and excessive punishment that drive the perceived need for speeding up the bail court were nonetheless obscured. During our fieldwork, we learned from speaking with lawyers that high volumes of bail applications are typically churned through the court during weekend sessions. The first time we conducted observations on the weekend, we witnessed 24 hearings in just 5 hours. In comparison, the most we'd ever seen on a weekday in the same amount of time was only 13. And so while the accelerated churn in the stretched system of the weekend bail court undoubtedly made the court more efficient, the process was hastened by the absence of proper advocacy and assessment services. So for these reasons, one defence lawyer we spoke to likened it to a sausage factory where cases are churned through. This apt metaphor invokes earlier scholarly observations of magistrates' courts operating as a kind of conveyor belt, replete with unrepresented defendants and permeated by an ideology of triviality. I'm referencing there McBarnett's work from the early 80s. As Peters and Turner have argued, power can be expressed by how much a volume might be filled and how densely it might be packed. So the expansion of the bail court's capacity to process individuals then is no doubt an expression of carceral judicial power. But it also shows how carceral churn is dynamic and flexible. Systems can stretch on demand according to bureaucratic logics of efficiency and with little regard for justice in process or outcome. So lastly, the concept I want to explore is webs of exclusion. So while rapid remand growth is of course deeply concerning, our research found that the problem with the churn of the bail court is not solely penal expansion. Regardless of the pace of criminal processing, the bail court is not a neutral site for the administration of justice. The churn of the court is institutionally violent, and it reproduces webs of exclusion that span civil, criminal, and socio-legal spaces. A key example of this is the layering of hybrid civil criminal legal orders and the proliferation of secondary criminalisations. So namely breaches of bail, parole, and various other court orders that attract escalating punishments. This is something I want to look into further in future research, but for now I'll talk you through one anecdote from our fieldwork that illustrates how these webs of exclusion proliferate. So we observed one hearing that involved a 25-year-old Aboriginal man who was homeless and appearing in the bail court for the 4th time in 5 months for repeated breaches of a personal safety intervention order. The order was a civil legal order and as such does not require a high burden of proof to put in place, but breaching an order is a criminal offence. So they're thus better described as kind of quasi-criminal or part of the shadow carceral state, in Beckett and Marikwawa's words, that blurs and widens the traditional boundaries of criminal punishment. In this young man's case, the order prevented him from coming within 200 metres of a centrally located homeless shelter run by a well-known charity. Yet he continued to sleep on the footpath outside the shelter because, as his lawyer explained, his friends slept inside and he felt unsafe sleeping at other homeless shelters. The magistrate on this day noted that this man's charges reflected the most low-end breaches occurring in a very unusual and extraordinary circumstances. Nevertheless, he was convicted of 3 charges for breaching the order and sentenced to 1 day in prison, which was recorded as time already served since he'd already spent a night in the basement cells of the court. In an attempt to halt this cycle of reincarceration, the magistrate booked a court date in 1 week's time to vary the order, such that the accused could, at the very least, lawfully sleep outside the shelter. Through observing this case, we bore witness to the criminalisation of poverty, but we also learned of a transcarceral experience and pattern of police dislocating and relocating this man from the street to the court cells and back again, repeatedly. This coerced mobility and carceral entrapment continually recast him as criminal and incorrigible, and undoubtedly only reproduced his conditions of poverty and social marginality, as the application of this civil order had now established his record of criminal offending and prior prison sentences, however short. But these make avoiding future prison time increasingly difficult, lest his social and economic circumstances drastically change. So as I noted at the beginning of this paper, the research...
left.
Thank you.
5 minutes left. Thank you.
The research was motivated to deepen understandings of the micropolitics and processes that facilitate carceral expansion, since the majority of recent growth in Australian prisons is attributed to remand. However, by attuning to the sensory aspects of coerced mobilities through the court and by capturing the details of the displacements and the entrapments it involves, we were able to better understand the violence and power effects of carceral mobilities, which extend well beyond the courtroom itself. I think more broadly, we learned through this research the importance of, or relearned the lesson of not simply observing and describing or recording carceral violence, but bearing witness to it in order to challenge it. Also, the importance of drawing attention to insidious forms of net widening and transcarcerality that proliferate from specific legal sites or socio-legal sites. For us, one of the most rewarding aspects so far of this research has been being able to build a collaborative project with a community organisation so that we can learn from, but also benefit and support social justice and abolitionist projects taking place outside of academic and university spaces. I'll wrap it up there. I think I spoke very fast.
That's fine. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Emma. Yes, fast it's also an acceleration from the researchers' side. I here have two questions online. First, you mentioned online hearings. Do you think they have affected the amount of people who received bail? And second question, do you know if this is done? The sardine 10, the basement cells, rushing through the courts, etc., on purpose as a way to psychologically affect the individuals, or is it something that just happens?
Yeah, great questions. Yeah, the first question, yeah, so the combination of the pandemic's impact on the criminal justice system and potentially the reliance on the digital courtroom or video links to conduct bail and remand hearings. Over the past 6 months, we've seen a really dramatic decline in the number of people going into prison on remand. So I believe in Victoria, it's down roughly 10%, and that's on the back of really significant and sustained growth over the past decade. There isn't any legislation at this point to support sustaining this decline or this decarceration. So, you know, my concern and concern of other advocates is that this is kind of an exceptional moment where magistrates as individuals have been less willing to remand people because of the excessive punishments associated with the pandemic. So, for example, every person going in on remand, even if they might only be on remand for 1 day or 2 days, has to serve a mandatory 2 weeks in quarantine, which is effectively a solitary confinement in the prison system. And also there's a ban on in-person visits, and I'm sure this is, you know, of course, very similar around the world. But so magistrates have been more willing to recognise, and particularly in the case of women with children, that remanding them in prison would be excessively punitive at this time. So that has had a flow-on effect. But whether that's because of the nature of conducting virtual hearings, I'm not so sure, because, you know, I know other research and accounts from lawyers we interviewed suggested that they were very skeptical of video links to create better outcomes for people, because largely because they were seen as having the potential to normalise people's incarceration, because a decision maker can see someone already in a carceral environment, which makes it much easier to leave them there, and, you know, they're not immediately in front of you. The second question was?
Second question was, do you know if this is done, the sardine 10, the basement cells rushing through courts, etc., on purpose as a way to psychologically affect the individuals, or is it something that just happens? That was the second.
So yeah, I don't know exactly. I guess I think it's a bit of both. So there was quite a lot of discourse that you know, there was a lack of funding and a lack of investment in the magistrates court, and I guess coming back to those ideas that the magistrates court is kind of seen as a very trivial space, and, you know, remands and short sentences aren't officially seen as punishments. You know, they're more administrative, so they're relatively neglected. So potentially it's a disinvestment in that particular aspect of the carceral system. You know, meanwhile they continue to, you know, invest huge amounts of money in the actual prisons. But I think also, yeah, I think there is that aspect of the cells having to be seen as a kind of deterrent, you know, that if they make them too comfortable, then, you know, it's not seen as kind of a shock or a significant intervention or disruption of someone's life that would then, you know, not deter them from future offending. And yeah, I think obviously that's incredibly problematic to, you know, to re-traumatize and inflict harm on people, many of whom are already, you know, profoundly traumatized and marginalized. So, yeah.
Thank you. I have here a question of Jason Danley. He says, wonderful presentation. I am curious about how charities or welfare organizations might contribute to the naturalization of transcarcerality or work against it and create other spaces of healing.
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea, and I think something that definitely needs further research. And I mean, in the case of that story I told of the young man who was, you know, sleeping out the front of the homeless shelter and continually being removed and put back into custody, you know, I think that was a very disturbing example of, yeah, I guess the like social services and social support organisations, their over-reliance on policing and carceral systems to kind of deal with people who they might see as too hard or too confronting or too risky or too challenging. And I think, you know, there absolutely needs to be more kind of discourse within social services sectors in particular about the importance of decarceration models and of challenging kind of existing stigmas and assumptions about people who are labelled criminals. But I think, yeah, that's definitely something worth looking at further. In terms of disrupting transcarceral spaces, I mean, I think, you know, the organisation we collaborated with is doing some really excellent work supporting women who have exited prison to lead and develop kind of solutions and creative problem solving for these kinds of cycles of criminalisation and remand that they continuously are subjected to. So I think there's definitely some kind of creative solutions.
Thanks a lot. We have 2 more minutes, so I suggest we take one more question. We have here, do you see sensory violence and webs of exclusion also in the community? I'm asking with the malopticon of McNeill in mind regarding community sentences. Can you repeat the second half of that question again? Sorry. The second part is, I am asking with the malopticon of McNeill in mind regarding community sentences. I think, yeah, that's another like really interesting topic for research, and I guess also shout out to Amber, who's presenting after me, who will talk a bit more about the way that community-based orders perpetuate surveillance and control as well. But yeah, I mean, I haven't looked in depth at that, and I think absolutely, you know, I'd imagine you would find these kinds of webs of exclusion, and you know, my concern with those webs really starts from that kind of civil legal realm and the way that can quickly escalate and proliferate these kind of new, really complicated entanglements with carceral systems that, you know, can happen really quickly and then can be very hard to undo unless you have significant resources at your disposal. Thank you. It's now 9:30, so I suggest we can move on to our second speaker. We had two more questions here, but I suggest we can just chat about it in the chat room a little bit later at the